two presentations today. The second one is more important than the first. Let's see, Elaine, Lechtreck, and I'm basically the warm-up act for that. So I'm going to be taking about 25 minutes, and then I will be introducing Elaine in her book, and then she will be drawing some stories from the book. You have the sheets in front of you, which you've had for 2 weeks if you've been here. So you may not even need to consult them if you want them. And I'm going to go back to a couple of things and go in a quick enough order to maximize the time. But here's the conference we went to in Charlotte in November, confronting whiteness. This is actually something I have never walked around with in public. But I call your attention to raise the whole issue of whiteness. You know, what is meant by that, and why would a conference title itself "Confronting Whiteness"? Well, it's because whiteness itself is a social construct. I mean, it didn't used to be white. And then about 500 years ago, there started being white people. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean by that, before 1500, you were British, Scottish. You might have an ethnicity. You might be from Serbia. You might be Roman. You might be Florentine. But you weren't white. I mean, no one thought of themselves as white. They just thought of themselves as people. And your ethnicity and your locality is what matters. And so the point about whiteness is a social construct. In some ways, it was constructed out of neo-colonialism, out of building empires, and counterpointing people who were not black to black. They were white. But actually, black came first. See what I mean? In terms of slavery, in terms of exploitation, black came first. Now, when you think about, there were no, I'm going to do a broad generalization here, but say in 1900 in America, the people weren't terribly white. You know, think about New York City in 1900. You were Italian, you were Irish, you were this, you were that. And you know, I mean, Irish, but a certain kind of people. The Wasps, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Catholics were not so sure about it. But eventually, as race issues people became more and more aware of them. More and more people were incorporated into whiteness, but for a long time, Italians were, for a long time, the Irish were. And if you're trying to understand what I'm talking about right now, watch what's happening with Hispanics in the country today. You know, Hispanics will be white in 30 years. Now, you know what I mean in terms of how people consider themselves and how they present themselves and how they identify themselves. And so the whole area is filled with premises and assumptions, history we don't know, and assumptions we aren't aware of. So I call your attention to that. Now I'm on page 7, and I want to make sure I get through everything, which means I'm going to get through everything forward. So I'm going to go to some things I really want to make sure we've covered before the end of this one. And that is the further readings at the bottom. A book by Chris Smith, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. That's a 2021 book, made most of the top 10 nonfiction book lists in the country. I recommend that book because it's part travelogue, part history, part interviews. It's very accessible. starts in New Orleans and works its way up through the country, comes to New York City and Washington at the end. But it's just so readable. And it really covers most of what we're talking about in the end. You can go into more depth in this book, but it really covers most of it. To me, it's a fantastic book. I mentioned James Baldwin because he's worth reading almost anything he's written. If you wanted, because he's written so much, I'm telling you where to start, which is The Fire Next Time. That's like a 50-page essay. Edward Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism. The best titled book I think I've probably ever been aware of. The Half Has Never Been Told. And because when I started reading that book, I realized the half has never been told about slavery. You know, I was sort of dealing with sort of a Virginia Southern gentleman notion of plantation, you know, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was bad enough, but, you know, a lot of good white messages too, you know. And where this book takes you is to the Cotton South. And that is a huge change, even in the history of blacks in America. When you basically get down to industrialized cotton, you are now going to bring every pound of cotton you can possibly get out of black people. And for instance, they'd be doing things like, pulling these numbers slightly out of the air, but they would be doing things like getting 25 pounds of cotton a day out of a worker. And 30 years later, they're getting 250 pounds. Now, that doesn't happen casually. That happens from every night when you don't make your quota, you get beat. And so if the quota is now 50, and you make 45, you get beat that night, the next day, you're going to find some way to make 50. Even if you have to teach your left hand to be a right hand. You follow what I'm saying, even with that, the things you have to twist physically to get a human being to get to the quotas that they eventually came up with. I mean, slavery was brutalizing. I mean, it was absolutely brutalizing. And this is the book that tells you that. The other part of it is, second part of the subtitle, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Slavery is what unfettered capitalism looks like. When all you're trying to do is maximize capital and you don't care about labor, and there are no regulations, you get to slavery. And the American economy was built, the capitalist system in America was first built on the back of black workers. That's, I mean, there was a point in time, somewhere around 1850, when black workers were like, the worth of black workers was like 40% of the GDP. I mean, that's how fundamental they were to the American economy at that time. So read the book. It's amazing. We read it in the Interfaith Book Club, and one of the women in the group who was Jewish, you know, after we started discussing it, probably she put her hand up. You know, I always thought the Holocaust was a one-off. You know, I didn't buy that anyone else had an experience like Jews had in Nazi Germany in World War II. And she said, this book made me rethink that. And you know, that was a powerful witness. Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, very recent too, What Racism Costs, Typical One, and How We Can Prosper Together. It's a tougher book. It's readable, but it's not a story, it's not narrative, it's not travel. It's she's getting down to the stuff that happened. And for instance, in 1950 in America, in a lot of major cities, there were huge public swimming pools. Huge, gargantuan. You can still find one or two in New York. New York had dozens of it at one time. You'd find them in cities like St. Louis and Birmingham and various other places. And then in the early 1950s, it was decided that the pools, they were for whites only. Public pools were for whites only. Little black kids were going down to the river, and after, a few of them drowned, publicity built up, and why can't they be in safe pools like the white people? And then civil rights kicked in, and laws were changed to say you can't segregate the public pool. In a lot of cities in America, you know what the response to that was? Fill in the public pool. I mean, fill it with dirt, fill it with concrete. If we have to integrate, nobody's using it. Now that's the point that Heather McGee is making. And she's saying it applies to healthcare, it applies to unions, it applies to the wealth gap, it applies to almost every aspect of the American economy. We all suffer from segregation and from discrimination. We all suffer from not being able to resolve the issues we're talking about today. You read about deaths of despair in the country. You know what I'm talking about by deaths of despair? I mean, people who are dying from suicide, alcohol, and drugs. Who are they? They're white people. Blacks are doing fine health-wise. The point is, whites are suffering from discrimination, from racial prejudice and discrimination across the country. We're all in this together, but sometimes there are elites in the country that want to keep us separated. So, for instance, labor doesn't form a united black-white front, because at that point, labor would become powerful again in the country. But that was crushed, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Not crushed, but severely weakened. And Heather McGee is taking you through all of that and saying, there's a huge dividend if we would just all start respecting one another mutually. Forget color, forget all the other ways we provide ourselves. Just let's respect one another. And then I throw this last book in at the end, called Forget the Alamo. It's not a central book to this topic, but it definitely reflects on this topic. And it's a fun read. It's written by 3 Texans a couple years ago, written in I don't know what I'd call Texan spirit. I mean, it's lively, it's large, it's witty, it's slightly irreverent, it's all of the above. But what they've done is gone into the history of the Alamo. And then when they came out of it, they spent a lot of time talking about it. And since then, what has been the result? But I'll just stick with the history of the actual battle. In American mythology, it's Americans fighting for freedom against the dastardly Mexicans. In real history, what it is cotton plantations are moving into Texas, and so are cotton owners, and so is slavery. And the people fighting in the Alamo are fighting to preserve the cotton economy against an absolutely abolitionist Mexico. Mexico had broken off from Spain 10 years earlier. They were tired of hierarchies, and they had gone completely anti-abolitionist. And so Santa Anna was an abolitionist politician of substantial stature in Mexico. Okay, the point I'm making is, let's get the history straight. Let's not be blocking history, because the facts are not what some people have thought, or most of us have thought. I grew up thinking, David Crockett was great. And for the record, David Crockett was like one of the better people in the Alamo. but they were heroes. They were the Americans against the dastardly Mexicans. Not true. It was enslavers versus abolitionists. Okay, the thought questions. Now here's my apology. I think some of these questions are fairly important. I think some of these questions could take the whole period by themselves. And I think it would merit that discussion. We're not doing it because I'm going to get Elaine up here at the right time. So I'm going to run through the thought questions. I would encourage you to, if you look at this and say, yeah, we should be talking more about this. Come to someone, Chris, Elder, me, somebody, and say, let's set up a time and work with some of these more. Because I think that could be valuable. But just today, 4 weeks for ending it now, for now. But okay, here are the questions. This first one's critical. And what is the role of the church in critiquing how our democratic nation is governed and structured, and how care is taken for those in need? That's essentially when people say you're talking about politics, and you shouldn't do it in the pulpit. Essentially, you're basically at that point saying the church cannot critique how our democratic nation that counts on critiquing itself, how it's governed and structured, and how care is taken for those in need. And my observation is, where are these matters better discussed than where grace and love reign? Now, 3 weeks ago when we began this, I talked about my own personal history. Ken McAdams and I disagreed about practically everything except that we loved one another. And so we learned a whole lot from one another. Well, I learned a lot from him. You never know what Ken learned. But I mean, where it could be done with humor and with respect, and you know, we come closer to the truth when we're having respectful conversations from people we know we can learn from. That would be like all of you in this room. You know, I mean, the conversations that happen in friendship and grace that are where true knowledge begins. Number 2, what is the importance of narrative, of how we tell the American story? That's a fundamental question. What is the importance of narrative, of our national narrative, how we best tell the story of our nation? And so, for instance, if you're listening, the traditional story, we are a nation aspiring toward democracy and freedom. Founding fathers were flawed. They were people of their time, but they understood a whole lot more about the principles of democracy and freedom than pretty much anyone in the world at that time. And we didn't implement it all that well right then, but we have always been experimenting and step by step making greater and greater progress toward that. That is probably the received story of America. The story you hear more often is it's a nation built on genocide, slavery, and discrimination. Okay, which is true. Yeah, which is true. How are you going to tell the story? Which story inspires hope? You see what I'm saying there? I mean, if you tell a story that you go back to the first quotes I said, no one wants to be made to feel badly about their country. And so if you're out there understanding what slavery really was, and understanding what discrimination is, and understanding Jim Crow, understanding the civil rights movement, you say, that story's got to be, yeah, that story's got to be told, but don't lose track of the larger American story. Because it's a larger American story that inspires people and draws them together and keeps them together. So but keep thinking through, how are you going to tell the American story? For sure, it has to be told truthfully. There's no value in school boards or state governments or the federal government or anybody else coming in and saying, you can't tell it that way. Not in a free country. There's no value in that. The truth has to be told. But how are you going to tell it in ways that inspire hope and courage? Okay, what makes a truly great nation? Is this a legitimate concern of the church? And we could spend 25 minutes right there. What is our understanding of various things? Affirmative action, Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, cancel culture, and anti-racism. I'm going to make a comment on a couple of things. If you're against affirmative action, I would assume you're against legacy admissions too. You know how universities work in the country. Like in Princeton, you might have an incoming freshman class of 2,000, 1,300 of them will be related to alumni and so on and so forth. No one has a problem with that. What is that? That is really powerful, effective affirmative action for white people, for white rich people. Point being, if you're going to be against affirmative action, then be consistent, be against it all. Or maybe recognize it has to be done on a case-by-case basis, but be consistent, that there could be some value in it, or get rid of it for everybody. You know, and it's the kinds of things that until you peel up the cover, you don't really see what's all happening in here. I'm going to say something on critical race theory, which, you know, you're welcome to push back on in your own mind and conversation with me. We can have sessions on it later, but the more I read about critical race theory, I'm almost pretty sure no one who talks about it knows what it is. You know, it's a pretty technical academic pursuit, and it's actually, if you really know what it is, it's happening a whole lot less than anyone thinks. The way it's used in common language is, if it makes me uncomfortable, it's critical race theory. That, as near as I can get to what, you know, how it's actually being used, that's what is meant by it. Okay. Debbie picked up on what place does shame have in tracking Black history, and I would say a whole lot less than it often does. Shame is not the way forward. Recognition of the truth is the way forward, but shame is not a terribly helpful emotion across the board. When privilege is all one caste has ever known, what does equality feel like to them? Okay, if privilege, you know, I'm talking now about white privilege. And if someone comes in and says, no, it's got to be equal across the board, and you've been the beneficiary of white privilege your whole life, and some of you probably know that you are, and some of you probably feel, what? When did that start? And I understand that. But for those who really enjoy the benefits of white privilege, and that's not all white people, I'll grant that real quick, but for the people who've really enjoyed the privileges of being white, equality, someone insisting on equality looks like an attack. It's not. It's equality, but it's going to feel like an attack. You know, it's a matter of figuring out the history here. The last two questions are critical, and I think church has to figure them out, has to be on top of it. What is the role of diversity and inclusiveness in churches following Jesus? And then what does it mean that as followers of Jesus, our primary allegiance is the kingdom of God? That's the one, I mean, if you're picking up, you're going to walk out of here after these 4 weeks with one point. That would be the point I want you to walk out with. I would want you to walk out with. That as followers of Jesus, our primary allegiance is the kingdom of God. And how can we tell if this is our primary allegiance? Those are critical questions. How do you tell? If you walk out of this church because of politics, your primary allegiance is not the kingdom of God. Politics is more important than the kingdom of God. There are other tips too. You know, how many hours a week do you spend on one? And how many hours a week do you spend on the kingdom of God? You know, those are the questions that become critical that churches have to hold on to. Okay, I'm going to get Elaine up here after a brief introduction. Elaine is a sort of a hidden civil rights hero, and it's pretty easy to kind of miss that. But for 25 years, she worked on a project with the university systems in Mississippi. And on interviewing white pastors, white ministers in the South that were white in the 1940s, 1950s, who believed in civil rights, believed blacks should be treated the same as whites, believed in justice and equality, but were pastors of churches. And the price these men often paid. Every so often you had a white pastor who was a pastor of a black church. Well, he did great. You know, that was a honeymoon made in heaven. They were all on the same page. But if you were a pastor of a white church, and you know, you could be a pastor of a white church and 2/3 of your church might actually agree with you, and 1/3 is creating chaos. You know, and eventually, you know, usually if 1/3 of the church is creating chaos, the rest is gone. You know, and that's what happened to these guys too, in addition to physical threats and various other things. Elaine, 30 years ago, I guess, started interviewing these men and getting their stories. Their stories would have been lost because they were in their 60s, 70s, by that time, 80s, and numbers of them are dead now. Elaine had been interviewed. She worked really, really hard on writing a good book. She's a master in the English language, and she ended up getting this book published, Southern White Ministers and the Civil Rights Movement. I have an autographed copy here. Even more important, you have all my notes here, and we are selling this for $100. Okay. Anyway, it's a remarkable book, and it's just good reading for itself, but from a historian standpoint, it's more than that, because it covers a layer of research that the whole country would not know if it wasn't for your doggedness in making sure we did them. Thank you. Come on up.
Well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to speak about the book, which it takes a very long time to find a publisher, just to gather all the stories, but it was a wonderful experience. And it's about whiteness, just as Bill was talking about. What it meant to be white in the South during the segregation era, which started right after the Civil War, when laws were passed that Black people had to be separated. They had separate churches. Dale has explained all of this. Well, anyway, the South seemed to be divided. The white people seemed to be divided between those that wanted change and those that didn't want change. And for a while there, during the Civil Rights Movement, the white segregationists who did not want change seemed to overpower those that did want change. So there were two Souths, always two Souths. Now, the stories I told are of white ministers who wanted change, but it was very difficult for them to speak about supporting an end to segregation. As my book tells, they were treated very badly. The churches considered them traitors and would ostracize them, torment them, sometimes treated them worse than Black activists. So this was the situation. It took a lot of bravery for these men to make their stand. Now, in my book, I tell the story of a Church of Christ minister his name is Al Price. He called me up in 2013, well after my book was being written, being published. It was already at the University of Mississippi Publishing House. He heard that there was a woman in Connecticut writing about Southern white ministers, and he wanted his story included. So he sent me his story, and it appears in my book, Al Price. His first attempt at trying to change society occurred in 1960. He was minister of a large church of Christ in Jackson, Mississippi, where the elders were standing in front of the church doors before people came in. Why were they there? He wondered when he started. He was only 23 years old. Well, they were there to keep out Black agitators who were trying to enter a white church. And he thought to himself, this is not scriptural. This is not according to Jesus' teachings. And at that point, he was not ready to be an activist or to speak out to the church against it, but he preached about the Good Samaritan and about brotherhood in his sermons. He tried to influence the people to be more loving. And they did have a little message on the church, all are welcome, but didn't include African Americans. Anyway, after a while, the people must have gotten the message because the elders stopped standing in front of the church. But in 1967, Price decided he didn't want to be a minister at a big church anymore. It was too stressful. So he went to Tennessee to start graduate studies in sociology, which was a way to understand societal problems that people had, unemployment, welfare, etc. And he began his studies in Tennessee. Well, he married there and had his family, but he came back to Mississippi. He started preaching. He never really stopped preaching. Started preaching part-time in Tennessee. And in 1967, I guess, in 1973, that was in 1967. In 1973, he came back to Mississippi, wanting to continue studying for his doctorate at the State University of Mississippi in Scotland, Sparksville. And he took a part-time job at the Winona Church of Christ, which was a fairly small church, but also completely segregated. What he didn't know was that the church was completely divided because a Black woman had asked to be baptized in the church, and they baptized her. When that happened, many of the people left the church, including the pastor. So the pastor's house was empty, and this departing faction started Sunday services in the pastor's house. this is the house that the Price family were to move in as he was going to become the pastor. Well, what happened to him was really terrible. And he was considered to be an enemy, a traitor by the white segregationists. Fortunately, there was a nucleus in the church that didn't feel that way. They persecuted him. They, when he was trying to move in, they came with guns and trucks. One man knocked him down and injured his jaw, had a fractured jaw. And that was the night before he was supposed to preach. The next morning, he went to the church and he could hardly speak. When he got home, they were waiting for him. And again, they would stop his telephone from ringing, from working. They cut his water off. So he called the police, tried to get the police to help him. The police told him, oh, go see the mayor. He went to see the mayor. The mayor didn't really help him, told him, well, if they keep persecuting you, we'll issue John Doe warrants of arrest. Well, they did keep persecuting him and attacking him in small ways. They sent a dog, a big German shepherd came into his yard while his daughter was playing and would have killed her if they hadn't been able to chase him away with a baseball bat. These are the kind of stories he tells in his Gravel and Grit, his memoir that he finally wrote. But anyway, after 7 years, he couldn't take it anymore. So he moved back to Tennessee and started teaching at Freed-Hardeman University. You know about that. And taught sociology and was able to finish his degree finally. Well, to make a long story short, the whole experience transformed him. So his is a story of transformation. Now, when he was back in Tennessee, his phone rang, and the man that had beaten him and hit him down on the ground and broke his jaw had telephoned him, but he would not speak to him. He wouldn't answer the phone. 37 years later, he telephoned the man in Winona who had been a member of the Winona Church of Christ. Well, that was a big shock to the man. And he said, I was calling to tell you how sorry I was to have beaten you up, and to tell you how wrong I had been to persecute Black people. And he apologized, and he told them that the church was now united, no longer divided, and there were Blacks that attended, and everything was changed, everything. There was a Black person in the church who wanted to become a minister, and this man from Winona was helping him. So that really made a good end to the story. Is my time up?
We've got 4 minutes left. 4 minutes left.
Oh, 4 minutes. Okay. Well, Price continued in Tennessee to preach for change. And he would tell the story of many, in many churches, black churches and white churches, of the wonderful beginnings of the Christian church that was totally inclusive, containing proselytes and people from all over the Mideastern region, Cretans and Jews. And he also, in 21-3, he attended a reunion of the Selma to Montgomery March. His picture at the Pettus Bridge is in my book. And he wanted to tell his students that this was the event that changed the history of the United States. Now, in 2020, it took him that long to get his memoir published and to include all the gruesome stories about what happened in Mississippi, the murders and the discrimination. Anyway, he couldn't tell these stories during the segregation era because the church, as other churches, demanded that pastors remain silent about gross injustice. And so it took him that long. Now the book is very inspiring because he tells about how his family lived during the Great Depression. He was born in 1941, and the hardships were terrible for white people and for black people. But the white people didn't know what was going on in the black neighborhoods. They only knew about their own struggle. And that's what it was like for him in Mississippi. And he wrote another book called Ethereal, a novel about a 17-year-old boy and his best friend, Joe Nathan Markham, who were brash and daring and have adventures throughout the South. And they try to speak also for brotherhood. So he's quite an accomplished man, and I couldn't tell the whole story in the version in my book.
Thank you so much. We're very grateful for this short time with you, and we look forward to having some more time to hear more of the stories from your book. We're so grateful for Dale and for Debbie and for Wendell, who have shared during this series, and all of this is archived on the website, and so please feel free to share that and access it, as well as notes that were shared during this time. We're back to Ecclesiastes next Sunday morning, and we invite all of you to be back for that study as it continues. Before you leave today, if you could take your chair and put it in this closet, that would help us, because there are multiple groups using this room throughout the week, so that would be a great help. Any closing comments?
Yeah, I would say that is our Elaine. We get her up there to talk about her book, and she promotes books by someone else.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good morning.